This is Shane Musall recording my presentation for the research topic of divorce and remarriage. I feel like this is a topic within the church that needs to be spoken upon, that is very prevalent as we see divorce numbers in the church are high, just like divorce numbers outside of the church. And so I believe more and more churches are going to have to deal with divorce and remarriage, and even what does it look like for divorce and remarriage potentially for pastors or leaders within the church? And so I really want to look at this idea of remarriage is acceptable for a divorced Christian within the biblical guidelines. So we're going to see there's biblical guidelines for divorce and there's also guidelines for remarriage. Now, we have to define some terms then when it comes to divorce and remarriage. First, we have the term divorce. While we use this a lot, or it's prevalent within our society and culture, the definition is a legal or customary decree that a marriage is dissolved. The marriage is dissolved. Then we have an annulment. This is a declaration issued by a tribunal of the church that a valid marriage had not existed prior to the dissolution of the relationship. This is the idea that the marriage didn't exist. We see this sometimes with celebrities that maybe get married and annul the marriage, that the relationship didn't even exist. This is not something we, in the Protestant church, that we deal with, I would say, more that often. It's something that's dealt with by the Roman Catholic Church much more. And that has to do with the idea within the Roman Catholic Church of being excommunicated or no longer being allowed to take part in the Eucharist or communion if you're divorced and remarried, and so they seek annulment. And then there's desertion, which is abandoning a spouse in marriage. And sometimes this is considered grounds for divorce. I would argue it is grounds for divorce. And so we have to define those terms. We also have to start from this foundation that God hates divorce. Malachi 2:16. God hates divorce, and so for the believer, divorce is not the first option on the table. In fact, it should be the very last option, and it should be the toughest one to come to because there is so much emotional impact from divorce. That marriage is a covenant and joining of two people. And we hear this said all the time. If you go to a marriage or go to a wedding, you'll hear what God has joined together, let no man separate. And so that has this idea, this union, man and woman coming together spiritually almost. And divorce is big and it's heavy and it has an impact. But there are biblical grounds. And so I would say that these are the biggest, most pro arguments for divorce for the believer, that there are some maybe different categories, but I think ultimately you can boil it down to these two categories for divorce that are sexual immorality and abandonment. That it's within those two categories that we see biblical grounds for divorce. There are some that would say divorce is never possible, but I would strongly disagree with that, purely based on what we see here in the Bible. And as believers, this should be our ultimate authority. We see here from Jesus speaking in Matthew 5:31, where he says that whoever divorces his wife, or it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And so he's speaking to the Mosaic law here that the Israelites, the Jewish leaders, would have clearly understood back and forth. And so he's speaking to that law, and he says, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So we see here a clear standard is set by Jesus that except on the grounds of sexual immorality, that phrase means sexual immorality is a ground for divorce, and that the ramifications of that divorce based on sexual immorality, there is not the warning here of causing adultery to happen in new relationships after that. But sexual immorality is a basis for divorce. It's very clear. In fact, I really could not find any other Christian writing that would argue against that. You could find some that would argue an even stronger or even weakened view of what the word sexual immorality means. That almost felt like going back to the Mosaic almost idea of allowing a man to leave his wife for no strong reason rather than just to leave her. We also see here this idea of abandonment. If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. This is Paul writing, and he's speaking here in 1 Corinthians 7 about believer and non-believer being married. And what this looks like. And so he speaks the idea if the unbeliever is willing to stay with the believer. And this almost has the idea of one coming to Christ after marriage, but potentially could have been before. But he says if the unbeliever is willing to stay, then stay. Don't divorce just to divorce. But if the unbelieving partner leaves, let it be so. All right, you're not held into this relationship. There's more writing that speaks to this idea of abandonment in even a broader sense that if a spouse is unwilling to provide basic necessities, basic needs for the other, food, water, shelter, that kind of abandonment is applicable or is also grounds for divorce, and I would hold to that idea as well. And so that's just a basic cover of what it means for a believer to be divorced or where the grounds are. But the bigger question is what about remarriage? Now, some would argue that remarriage should just be widely accepted. That if you're a believer and you get divorced, then get remarried. But I would disagree with that. I believe that just as there's biblical guidelines for what divorce looks like, then there are biblical guidelines for remarriage. And my argument here will come from Scripture, but I believe it is the strongest and it's backed up by writing that I found. And so Mark 10:10, and this also goes back to the writing we saw in Matthew, that it's speaking to the same idea here from Jesus. And says, he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So we see here when there's a divorce that doesn't meet biblical standards, that to enter into new relationships causes adultery to happen. Adultery is committed. Right, and so it's not as simple as this marriage didn't work out. Let me try another one. Let me try another. In fact, a writer I found spoke to this idea. And he said, I've known divorced and remarried pastors who have a divorce rate in their church above 50%. Right? Leadership, right? If our leadership is modeling this, then the congregation, why would they not model it? And he speaks to the idea that a divorced and remarried man stood up and talked about how blessed his second marriage is. And that sends a signal to all those who are having marriage troubles that a trade-in might produce more happiness. Right? When we are lackadaisical about marriage and we treat it as something that can be ended and started again, we risk big-time problems. Because we see here Jesus speaks to this idea when we divorce outside of biblical grounds for divorce, when we enter new relationships, we are causing adultery to be committed. Right? We have to take this serious as a body. And so we see here, biblical grounds for divorce can lead to paths to remarriage. 1 Corinthians 7, again, Paul says, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. This speaks to the idea of leaving behind your spouse on unbiblical grounds. And so we, as believers, if we are divorcing on unbiblical grounds, we are causing sin to be committed. All right, Paul's charging us here to not separate, but if we do separate, we should remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Now, I believe this is speaking to the idea of Christians separating on unbiblical grounds for divorce. This is adultery was not committed, abandonment did not happen. They are separating for another reason. Now, I believe some Christians may take this another step further and apply it to those that have biblical grounds for divorce and say, I will not, pastors will say, I will not remarry someone who is marrying a second spouse unless that first spouse is passed away because they're still married to that first one then. I don't believe that's what this is speaking to. This is speaking to, in my opinion, where through my research and what I've read, this is speaking to the idea of being remarried or attempting to remarry after an unbiblical divorce. Again, divorce should never be the first option for a believer. And so, is there grounds for remarriage? Well, I think there is when we see here that when we seek divorce for biblical reasons, the path to remarriage is there. But I do not believe it is there for both parties. I believe the party that was sinned against, the offended party here, has a path to remarriage. They did not commit the sin that caused divorce. I believe the offender, the one that did cause this sin, the path is not necessarily there to begin with. But through reconciliation with the one they've offended, there is a path to remarriage. I believe this speaks to the grace and mercy that we see in our own relationship with God, that He gives us grace and mercy. We see this in the Old Testament. We see this consistently with the nation of Israel, how they turn their back on God, and there's this picture of marriage that God still is there for them. That the offended, the one that's been sinned against, has a path to take. But the offender has to seek some reconciliation, not only to build a relationship back with the one they offended, but I believe to begin on a path towards the potential for remarriage. Now, what about 1 Timothy 3 and elders? Right, this is a natural step in the next direction. What does it mean for elders? In 1 Timothy 3 and this idea of husband of one wife. Does that mean a man that's divorced on biblical grounds can never be an elder? I believe that is not true. I believe what is being spoken to here specifically is polygamy within the church, that Paul is speaking out against that. So that's my idea, my thought in divorce and remarriage. Through my research, a lot of what I found has been centered around the Catholic faith. I believe Protestants, we have not grasped or tackled this topic as well. And I believe it's because the Catholic faith sees marriage as much more spirit-filled, not necessarily spirit-filled, but much more of a spiritual sense than possibly the Protestants do. And so, divorce within the Catholic Church leads to you not being welcome at the Eucharist, which is a very big deal. Protestants, we don't have that. In my own life, I recently had this struggle in a church I was working in where the pastor and another leader in the church were divorced and began a relationship that led to marriage, and the church wasn't necessarily prepared for what that meant and for how to handle that, and it led to issues. And so I think as Protestants, we have to, and as just believers, we have to know how we believe and what the Bible says on this topic.